but that's all right. But when I came here to America, when I landed in New York, one of the first things I did was to go to the Wall Street occupation, because I wanted to see what was it, and who were they, and what is that about, and how does it connect to the things that we've been fighting and writing about. And you know, clearly, whatever all the various strands are, and the fact that they don't have demand, and the fact that it doesn't have you know, identifiable leaders, still there is a connection between what's going on there and what's going on here, and that connection is that of exclusion. These are people who are excluded. I mean, they are clearly not the 400 families who own half the wealth of America, and they are not the 100 people in India who own 25% of India's GDP. So, you know, while all of us are people who believe in something, I mean, I think all of us in this room, and we are people who believe in revolution, who believe that the system must be brought down. But right now, for the moment at least, I was thinking that the least we can ask for to begin with is that there has to be a cap on all of this. You know, there has to be a lid on it. And I thought I'm a capist and a lidite. and we do need to say a few things. You know, one is that no individual can have an unlimited amount of wealth. No corporation can have an unlimited amount of wealth. And this sort of cross-ownership of businesses really has to stop. You know, in India there are so many, of course. The Tatas are the biggest company. They own iron ore mines, steel mines, iodized salt, television channels. They manufacture trucks. They fund activists. They do everything. You know. So there's an iron ore and steel plant, a steel company called Jindal's. They have iron ore mines, steel mines. The CEO is in Parliament. He's a member of Parliament. He's also the member of the National Flag Foundation because he won the right to fly the national flag on his house. They run a global law school just outside Delhi, which is like a Stanford campus in the midst of the most unbelievable squalor you can imagine, where they have faculty from all over the world paid huge salaries. They fund and promote cutting-edge artists who work in stainless steel. And they recently had a protest workshop. You know, so they flew in activists into this unbelievably posh campus, and then you had sort of protest poetry and protest slogans, and so they own everything. They own the resistance, they own the mines, they own the parliament, they own the flag, they own the newspapers. You know, they don't let anything go. So, you know, these are some simple things that have to stop. That you just can't. Berlusconi owns 90% of the media in Italy. So what if he's not the prime minister? You know, so it's a kind of insanity that's set in, which could have some simple solutions too. Like, for example, perhaps children shouldn't inherit the wealth their parents amass. You know? So I'm just going to read the end of the book and then I'll go away. Can we expect that an alternative to what looks like certain death for the planet will come from the imagination that has brought about this crisis in the first place? It seems unlikely. The alternative, if there is one, will emerge from the places and the people who have resisted the hegemonic impulse of capitalism and imperialism instead of being co-opted by it. Here in India, even in the midst of all the violence and greed, there is still hope. If anyone can do it, we can. We still have a population that has not been completely colonized by that consumerist dream. We still have a living tradition of those who have struggled for Gandhi's vision of sustainability and self-reliance, for socialist ideas of egalitarianism and social justice. We have Ambedkar's vision, which challenges the Gandhians as well as the socialists in serious ways. We have the most spectacular coalition of resistance movements with their experience, understanding and vision. Most important of all, India has a surviving Adivasi, that's an indigenous population of almost 100 million. They are the ones who still know the secrets of sustainable living. If they disappear, they will take those secrets with them. Wars like Operation Green Hunt will make them disappear. So victories for the prosecutors of this war will contain within itself seeds of destruction, not just for Adivasis, but eventually for the human race. That's why the war in Central India is so important. That's why we need real and urgent conversations between all those political formations that are resisting this war. The day capitalism is forced to tolerate non-capitalist societies in its midst and to acknowledge limits in its quest for domination, the day it is forced to recognize that its supply of raw material will not be endless, is the day when change will come. If there is any hope for the world at all, it does not live in climate change conference rooms or in cities with tall buildings. It lives low down on the ground with its arms around the people who go to battle every day to protect their forests, their mountains and their rivers, because they know that the forests, the mountains and rivers protect them. The first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those who have a different imagination, an imagination that is outside of capitalism as well as communism, an imagination which has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment. To gain this philosophical space, it is necessary to concede some physical space for the survival of those who may look like the keepers of our past, but who may really be the guides to our future. To do this, we have to ask our rulers, can you leave the water in the rivers, the trees in the forest? Can you leave the bauxite in the mountain? If they say they cannot, then perhaps they should stop preaching morality to the victims of their wars.
Done our job, the rest is up to you. Okay, so we're going to do Q&A for a few minutes. Yeah, we'll have to repeat the questions. I just want to say something before we do this, that in case it does come up, I think something that you and I share is I don't think hatred is too strong a word, a hatred for writers who lie. So if that ever happens to come up, that'd be fun to both take that on. Louder! Oh, sorry. Well, you missed some, I said some really interesting things, but don't worry about it. So you go ahead.
Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
I was wondering, during the lunch break, some of us were wondering, oh, sorry. Some of us were wondering about the level of technology. You mentioned, Derek, in one of your books, that maybe the hunter-gatherer level of technology is the only truly sustainable level if we're honest with ourselves. And I was wondering if the world that you envision, the post-revolutionary world, is hunter-gatherer level of technology, or if you see some sort of hybrid or what you're visioning.
Well, it seems pretty clear to me that and did people hear that? Basically, the question is, do I really believe that hunter-gatherer is the only level of technology that's sustainable? And it seems pretty clear to me that any way of life that is based on the use of non-renewable resources is by definition not sustainable. And likewise, any way of life that's based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources isn't sustainable. If every year there are fewer salmon than there were the year before, eventually there'll be none. And anybody who is not the head of the National Marine Fisheries Services can understand this. And I would then go a step further and say that any way of life that's based on the use of resources won't last. And what I mean by that is that so many indigenous people have said to me that the fundamental difference between Western and indigenous ways of being is that even the most open-minded Westerners perceive listening to the natural world as a metaphor. They perceive the world as consisting of resources to be exploited, as opposed to other beings to enter into relationship with. And this is really crucial because how you perceive the world affects how you behave in the world. And there's a great line by a Canadian lumberman: when I look at trees, I see dollar bills. And if when you look at trees, you see dollar bills, you're going to treat them one way. If you look at a bauxite mountain, you see dollar bills, rupees, you're going to treat it one way. If when I look at trees, I see trees, I'll treat it another way. If when I look at this particular tree, I see this particular tree, I'll treat it differently still. The same is true for fish, the same is true for bauxite mountains, the same is true for women. If when I look at women, I see orifices, I'm going to treat them one way. If when I look at women, I see women, I'll treat them another way. If when I look at this particular woman, I see this particular woman, I'll treat her differently still. I just saw a great example of this having to do with crabs. Just recently, about a year ago, I live on a coastal town, and the harbor master, in the newspaper, the harbor master was saying why crabbers work so hard during crabbing season. And he said each crab is worth about $1.50. And he said, if you can imagine all sorts of envelopes lying all over the ground, each one has $1.50 in it, you'd be picking them up as fast as you can. And that's true, except crabs aren't actually envelopes filled with $1.50. Crabs are beings with lives as valuable to them as yours is to you and mine is to me. Which doesn't mean that we can't eat them. Very, very quickly, I was doing a radio interview in Spokane, Washington several years ago, and the interviewer said, you know, Indians exploited salmon too. And I said, no, they didn't, they ate them. And he said, well, what's the difference? I said, well, they gave them respect for the spirit in exchange for the flesh. I knew that answer was kind of crap, but I'm a male, and so I'm required by law to answer every question that's asked of me. And so later on, that I had a long conversation with a tree that I had a long relationship with, and I said, what is the fundamental predator-prey relationship? And the tree gave me the answer, which is, if you consume the flesh of another, you take responsibility for the continuation of the other's community. So if I consume salmon from the Klamath River, I take responsibility for the continuation of the Klamath River salmon community. Not stewardship, which comes from the sty ward, which is the ward of the pigsty, but instead responsibility, which comes from the root respondere, which means to give in return. So they give me their life, I give them my life. But back to the original point, no, the only level of technology that's sustainable is something that doesn't harm the land base at all. And eventually we will either, by definition, be living that way, or we won't be living at all. So no, the only ways of living that have been, and I want to say clearly that where I live is Tolowa land, and the Tolowa lived there for 12,500 years if you believe the myths of science. And if you believe the myths of the Tolowa, then they lived there since the beginning of time. And that's a long, long time. And the dominant culture has been there 180 years and the place is trashed. So yeah, the only level of technology, we can fantasize all we want, but the only level of technology that's sustainable is one that is not based on non-renewable resources and not based on the hyper-exploitation of renewable resources.
color makes you willing to post the story. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that and any advice in terms of bridging multiple and diverse struggles.
The question is that the Occupy Wall Street movement has somehow excluded less privileged communities and people of color, black people, and so on. I think, you know, it's interesting that it's the reverse of what happens in a place like India, you know, where the privileged people are not involved in any movements unless they are very right-wing movements, you know. And so I think even the anti-war movement, I remember being here on a march and being interested in the fact that there were not that many black people or people of color involved, and even in this audience there aren't. And I mean, I'm not exactly the right person to answer that question, but I think perhaps it does have to do with maybe the fact that they don't even have the leisure to be able to be involved. You know, maybe, I don't know if I'm wrong about that, but so, like for example, when you're trying to mobilize politically in a city in India, the people who are really at the bottom of the barrel have to work so hard night and day that they don't have time. They don't have time to listen to or go to political meetings or to be involved, and they are so fragile that they simply can't afford to. You know, the old days of workers' unions and labor unions and things, all that has been dismantled. So I don't know, maybe Derek, you have a better answer for this question here, about here.
No. Being a male, I'm going to say one thing. Which is, there's a term for what you're talking about that I've heard is called primary emergency, where oftentimes if someone becomes an activist, if they have the leisure to become an activist, a lot of times they will go after the primary thing that is affecting them. So I thought about this a lot after I talked to John Stauber, who's an anti-public relations industry activist. He does great work. He's a white male, and so in many ways he has the leisure to do that, as opposed to many times if a woman becomes an activist, many times one of her first issues might be men's violence against women. And that might be the place, it's not to say everybody, but that might be the first place someone goes. And so I just wonder where that question of primary emergencies fits into this. I think I'm just saying it's pretty good.
The other part was about advice for bridging multiple and diverse struggles. What advice might you give?
I'm very bad at giving advice, very bad. You know, because I would really like to know more about what's going on here before I gave advice. You know?
But actually, there's a woman of color here who might be.
Well, I think you know, this appearance of bottled water is such a terrible thing. You know, it's quite recent. I come from the state of Kerala, which is the southernmost part of India, where there's a huge agitation, quite successful one, against Coca-Cola, because they individual can have an unlimited amount of wealth. No corporation can have an unlimited amount of wealth. And this sort of cross-ownership of businesses really has to stop. You know, in India there are so many, of course. The Tatas are the biggest company. They own iron ore mines, steel mines, iodized salt, television channels. They manufacture trucks. They fund activists. They do everything. You know. So there's an iron ore and steel plant, a steel company called Jindal's. They have iron ore mines, steel mines. The CEO is in Parliament. He's a member of Parliament. He's also the member of the National Flag Foundation because he won the right to fly the national flag on his house. They run a global law school just outside Delhi, which is like a Stanford campus in the midst of the most unbelievable squalor you can imagine, where they have faculty from all over the world paid huge salaries. They fund and promote cutting-edge artists who work in stainless steel. And while all of us are people who believe in something, I mean, I think all of us in this room, and we are people who believe in revolution, who believe that the system must be brought down. But right now, for the moment at least, I was thinking that the least we can ask for to begin with is that there has to be a cap on all of this. You know, there has to be a lid on it. And I thought I'm a capist and a lidite. and we do need to say a few things. You know, one is that no individual, but that's all right. But when I came here to America, when I landed in New York, one of the first things I did was to go to the Wall Street occupation, because I wanted to see what was it, and who were they, and what is that about, and how does it connect to the things that we've been fighting and writing about. And you know, clearly, whatever all the various strands are, and the fact that they don't have demand, and the fact that it doesn't have you know, identifiable leaders, still there is a connection between what's going on there and what's going on here, and that connection is that of exclusion. These are people who are excluded. I mean, they are clearly not the 400 families who own half the wealth of America, and they are not the 100 people in India who own 25% of India's GDP. So, you know,